No delays, no excuses. That was the mantra of Boris Johnson's hugely successful election campaign. At its heart was an ambitious commitment to get a trade deal with the European Union wrapped up by the end of the transition period, the 31st of December 2020. The private view of Brussels bosses is not optimistic. 11 months is very unrealistic for such wide-ranging negotiations, was the verdict of EU negotiator Michel Barnier, revealed in leaked private remarks. Read more. Former trade bosses question Boris Johnson's trade deal claims, so who's right? City AM asked 5 former UK trade and business secretaries, all of whom were president of the Board of Trade, their views. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the group is split along Brexit lines. Remainers Sir Vince Cable, Lord Michael Heseltine, Lord John Hutton, and Lord Peter Mandelson all, with varying levels of gusto, pour cold water on the idea of reaching a satisfactory trade deal by 2021. Brexiter Lord Peter Lilly, on the other hand, deems it eminently doable. However, the former cabinet ministers touch on a number of the same issues. One is the fact that the EU will happily grant Johnson a deal by the end of the year, replete with access to its deep markets, so long as he abides by its rules. Yet another repeatedly raised issue is that the PM has no such intentions. His Brexit deal with the EU removed the chummier language Theresa May's had included, saying the future trade relationship would be ambitious rather than as close as possible. Former Liberal Democrat leader Cable was UK Business Secretary, and de facto Trade Secretary, in the coalition during tortuous trade talks between the EU and US. He says a UK-EU deal could indeed be done in a very short period of time if it was just a very simple agreement to tariff-free trade in areas which are already tariff-free. Lilly, Trade Secretary under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, is in agreement. This trade deal starts where most other trade deals end up, he says. Agreements over areas where the two sides diverge on rules and regulations can be readily done in a year. Read more. Boris Johnson thanks North of England for breaking voting habits of a generation, yet Cable says it would not be so simple. Should the UK and EU diverge, negotiations over rules of origin issues would become much more complicated. For example, if the UK agrees with, say, the US to cut tariffs on car parts, then they would come into Britain at a lower rate than into the rest of the EU. To make sure it isn't undercut, the bloc would then collect duties on British vehicles using those parts. This requires intricate agreements, Cable says. A major problem is that Britain hasn't worked out how far it wants to diverge from EU rules in the hopes of securing deals with countries further afield, says former EU Trade Commissioner Mandelson. He says the government rhetorically. For more on this story, visit the news article link.